The courtroom door swung open, and Ethan Caldwell walked in with a smug grin, his eyes full of defiance. He scanned the crowd before his gaze locked on the judge's seat. Spotting Camille Hartman, he burst into laughter. "You're the judge? That's rich. I thought I was in court, not a student internship." The room froze. Some held their breath, the prosecutor stiffened, and the court clerk quietly put down their pen. But Camille didn't flinch. She stared at him, her voice low yet razor-sharp. "Mr. Caldwell, I suggest you think very carefully before you speak again." Ethan smirked, crossed his arms, and took a step forward. "Oh, and what if I don't?" Camille tilted her head slightly, a smile flickering across her face, dangerous and cold. "Then you won't be smiling for much longer." In an instant, the officer tightened the handcuffs. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. For the first time in his life, he realized he was no longer in control. But what would happen next? Could he escape this situation, or was this just the beginning of a real nightmare? The courtroom was bathed in the cold, harsh light of overhead bulbs, every seat occupied by a silent, expectant crowd. The atmosphere was tense yet full of anticipation, as if everyone were waiting for an expensive drama to unfold. Amidst this charged environment, Ethan Caldwell strode in with the calm demeanor of a man who had never known fear. His expensive suit clung to his tall frame, each step echoing off the marble floor, exuding a confidence that made even the faint-hearted squirm. But he paid no attention to anyone. After all, to Ethan, everyone present was just a mere pawn, too insignificant to affect the world he had carefully crafted. He ignored the contemptuous stares from the crowd, the journalists scrambling to record every movement. The only thing that mattered to him was how he looked on camera. He raised his hand and adjusted his gold cufflink slowly, intentionally letting the light catch the gleaming metal. A half-smile curled on his lips as he thought of the irony of the situation. A trial? A farce. He had stood above the law for years, manipulating loopholes, bribing the weak with money, and now they truly believed they could bind him with a public trial. An officer signaled for him to move faster, but Ethan merely glanced at him with disdain, as if the man were no more than a speck of dust on his suit. As he reached the defendant's seat, his eyes flicked over those in front of him. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with bags under his eyes from sleepless nights, was hurriedly sorting through papers. His lawyer stood beside him, unable to mask the visible worry. But what truly caught his attention was the woman sitting at the highest podium, Judge Camille Hartman. He had heard of her, young, sharp, not easily manipulated. But to Ethan, that only made the game more intriguing. He narrowed his eyes, a mocking grin forming at the corners of his lips. A young judge? He had faced hundreds of judges before, most rigid, yet all ultimately broken by the might of money. No one could stand firm against numbers this big, and he believed Camille Hartman would be no exception. But when their gazes met, Ethan felt something strange. No wavering, no sign of hesitation or fear, only a calm, razor-sharp stare, as if she had already seen everything that was to come. She didn't look at him as a man sitting in the defendant's chair. She looked at him as though he had already lost. He just hadn't realized it yet. For a brief moment, Ethan's smile faltered, but he quickly shook his head, telling himself it was nothing but an illusion. He was still Ethan Caldwell. He was still the one in control. And this, after all, was just another meaningless trial. Camille flipped a page in the file, her eyes never leaving him. Her voice rang out, slow but firm, like a warning bell ready to toll. "Mr. Caldwell, I hope you are prepared today, because what happens here will not be like anything you've faced before." A heavy silence fell over the room as someone nervously swallowed. But Ethan only smirked, reclining in his seat, his eyes flashing with challenge. How many times had he heard this line before? And every time, the ultimate victor was always the same, him. But could this time truly be different? Could there be a force strong enough to bring Ethan Caldwell down? The answer would soon be revealed. Ethan leaned back in the defendant's chair, one hand resting on the armrest while the other absent-mindedly fiddled with the expensive watch on his wrist. He glanced at Camille Hartman with a look of amusement, as if evaluating a new piece on his chessboard. "So, you're the one running this circus?" He smirked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I thought I'd be facing something more powerful. I was expecting an experienced judge, not some intern." A few whispers rippled through the courtroom. Ethan's lawyer subtly tilted his head, a silent warning not to push too far. But Ethan didn't care. He was used to manipulating the weak in the legal system. Everyone had a price. It was just a matter of time. He watched Camille, waiting for a reaction, an ounce of confusion, anger, or even a flicker of fear. But Camille didn't blink. She sat there, turning a page of the file in front of her without showing the slightest emotion. When she lifted her gaze, it was as sharp as a blade, so cold that the air in the room seemed to lose its rhythm for a second. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice calm, yet carrying an invisible weight. "You can mock me as much as you want, but I suggest you think very carefully about your next words. This is not a negotiation, and it's not a boardroom where you can call the shots." Ethan raised an eyebrow and let out a soft chuckle, as if he were hearing an amusing story. "Oh? And what exactly are you planning to do? Convict me just because I haven't been polite?" Camille didn't answer right away. She set her pen down, interlaced her fingers, and tilted her head slightly. "I just want to remind you of one thing," she said slowly. "All those who think they're untouchable eventually fall in ways they never expected." The courtroom went deathly silent. A few people exchanged knowing glances, sensing that something very different was unfolding here. This wasn't like the trials Ethan had faced before, where he was the one in charge, the one pulling the strings. He felt it too, even if he didn't want to admit it. A strange, almost uncomfortable feeling crept into his mind, but only for a moment. Ethan smirked, propping his elbows on the table. "Nice line," he said, his tone light but laced with provocation. "But I've never fallen, Judge Hartman, and I don't think today will be the day it happens." Camille smiled, a brief, knowing smile, before tapping her fingers lightly on the file in front of her. "Well then, let's see," she said, turning to the prosecutor. "Let's begin the trial." The sound of the gavel striking the wood rang through the room, signaling that the game Ethan thought he had under control had long since slipped beyond his grasp. The courtroom door swung open, and a middle-aged woman slowly stepped in. She was small compared to those around her, her old coat hugging her thin frame, her trembling hands clenched tightly together. But when she lifted her face, her eyes shone with an unusual intensity, not from fear but from a steely determination. She was Linda Morrison, the first witness in today's trial. Ethan glanced at her with indifference. He had grown accustomed to seeing weak, insignificant people like this appear before him, pleading for mercy or blaming him for their failures. To him, they were nothing more than pawns on the business chessboard, meaningless, replaceable. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, not bothering to hide his contempt. "This is what passes for a witness," he muttered low enough for only his lawyer to hear. Linda stepped up to the witness stand, took a deep breath, and fixed her gaze on Camille Hartman. "Miss Morrison," Camille's voice was gentle but clear, "could you tell the court what happened to your family?" The room fell silent. Linda swallowed hard, her lips quivering, but she refused to look down. She turned her eyes toward Ethan, the man who had destroyed her life without ever looking back. "We lived in his building for over 15 years, Linda began, her voice hoarse. "My husband was a mechanic, working tirelessly every day to support our family. But then he fell ill, had to be hospitalized for a heart attack. I tried to keep up with the rent, but 1 month I was 2 weeks late." She paused, taking another deep breath. The audience behind her began to whisper. Some furrowed their brows, having heard countless similar stories, but no one could have predicted the horror that was about to be revealed. Linda turned to face Ethan for the first time since entering the courtroom. "I went to his office," she said, her voice growing steadier. "I begged him for just 1 more week. I told him my husband was in the hospital. I had the medical documents, and I would pay in full as soon as I could." Ethan didn't remember immediately, but then a faint image began to surface in his mind of a woman standing in front of his office, red-eyed, pleading. And then he remembered what he had done. He had laughed. Linda clenched her fists, her voice choking with emotion. "He didn't even look at my documents. He just laughed in my face and said, 'No money? Then get out. I don't run a charity.'" The room was dead silent. Some people gaped, the murmurs suddenly fading. A few reporters looked up from their notebooks, as if they couldn't believe what they had just heard. For a brief moment, Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine, but he quickly regained his composure. "I can't remember everyone who comes to beg me every day," he shrugged. "Business is business." Linda blinked, as though his words hurt her more than anything else. But she didn't stop. "We were thrown out on a rainy night," she continued, her voice turning icy. "His staff threw our things onto the street like trash. My husband, just out of the hospital, had nowhere to go. He sat on a friend's couch, coughing nonstop from the cold. And then, 3 days later, he died." The courtroom erupted. Some people gripped the armrests of their chairs. A young woman in the back wiped away tears. The prosecutor quietly clenched his file, while Camille kept her sharp gaze fixed on Ethan. Ethan said nothing for a moment. He could feel all eyes on him, full of anger, full of disgust. But he was used to it. He had been despised before, and he always came out on top. Linda turned to the judge, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. "I'm not standing here to beg for sympathy," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm here for him to take responsibility, so that no one else has to go through the pain my family endured." Camille nodded, her eyes still as cold as ice. "Miss Morrison," she said, "thank you for sharing." "Prosecutor, I want to review all documents related to this eviction." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, trying to maintain his composure. But deep down, he knew this trial was no longer a meaningless formality. It was a hunt, and this time, he was the prey. Camille Hartman flipped through the thick stack of documents in front of her, her gaze as sharp as a blade. The courtroom still buzzed with the whispers from Linda Morrison's testimony, but as soon as Camille spoke, everything fell into an absolute silence. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, looking up directly at the defendant, "Mrs. Morrison's case is not the only one. In fact, in the past 2 years alone, you've carried out over 200 evictions without following the legal process." The room seemed to hold its breath. The prosecutor pushed a thick file across the table to Camille, and she lifted it, flipping through the heavy pages, each one marked with signatures, seals, and sharp lines of text, undeniable evidence of what Ethan Caldwell had done. "This is a list of people evicted without prior notice, without time to prepare, without a chance to negotiate," Camille continued. "And this," she pulled out another file, "is a collection of their complaints, all ignored or deliberately suppressed by your legal team." Ethan tilted his head, narrowing his eyes, but kept the same mocking grin on his face. "Judge Hartman," he said, his tone light, as if discussing a cocktail party, "do you know how many people are late on their rent every day? I'm just following the contract. If they can't pay, they have to go. That's how the market works." Camille nodded slowly, as though expecting this answer. "So, you deny that you intentionally shortened the notice period to just 24 hours instead of the 30 days required by law?" Ethan squinted. "I'm just optimizing the process." The prosecutor stood and placed a photo on the table. It was of a young mother with 2 small children, standing in the middle of their belongings tossed out onto the street during a rainy night. "Was she also part of your optimized process?" he asked coldly. A wave of anger spread through the room. Some people shook their heads. An older man gripped the armrest of his chair as if holding back his fury. Reporters frantically scribbled in their notebooks, camera lenses zooming in on Ethan's impassive face. Ethan crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair. But if you looked closely, you could see a flicker of tension flash in his eyes. "I can't control every decision made by my company," he said, his voice firmer now. "I have a team responsible for these matters." Camille didn't seem surprised. "So, you're saying you didn't know about these decisions?" Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. "Exactly." Camille placed another stack of files onto the table. "How strange," she said slowly. "Because in the 35 most thoroughly investigated cases, every eviction notice carries your direct signature." The atmosphere in the room thickened. Ethan gripped the armrest of his chair, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the papers before Camille. He knew those documents well. He knew he had signed them. But what truly unsettled him wasn't the fact that they had this evidence. It was how they had gotten it. Camille tilted her head, her voice dropping but clear and heavy with weight. "Do you still want to deny it, Mr. Caldwell?" Ethan took a deep breath, then relaxed his shoulders, turning to his lawyer with a cold smile. "Nice move," he said, then turned back to Camille. "But what you're doing is just painting a tragic picture to gain sympathy. Justice doesn't work on emotion." Camille locked eyes with him, a calm but dangerous stare. "No," she said, "but it works on truth. And the truth is, today you sit here not because of a few isolated cases, but because of a systematic pattern of exploitation that you built yourself." The prosecutor placed another stack of files on the table. "Your Honor, the prosecution has additional witnesses and evidence to further clarify the true scale of the illegal actions committed by the defendant." Ethan blinked. "Another witness?" Camille nodded. "Good. Let's call the next witness." Ethan clenched his jaw. The anger started rising within him. He was used to controlling everything, but this time, things were slipping from his grasp, and he didn't like it one bit. Ethan Caldwell clenched his fists tightly, his knuckles turning white as Camille Hartman continued to expose the evidence against him. The room was silent, but the atmosphere was heavy, as if everyone could feel the collapse of a man who had once been untouchable. But what bothered Ethan the most wasn't the prosecutor or the angry audience. It was the feeling that something wasn't right. He wasn't stupid. Ethan had built his empire by understanding this world. He knew that the legal system could be bent to the will of those who truly held power. And at this moment, he couldn't help but wonder, why was this different? Something felt off. This didn't seem like the usual legal battle he had faced before. He had dealt with major lawsuits, powerful enemies. But this time, it seemed like a force was manipulating everything. Suddenly, his private lawyer's phone buzzed. Ethan didn't have time to think as the man sitting next to him furrowed his brow, looking at a message that had just popped up on the screen. He leaned in toward Ethan, speaking just low enough for only the two of them to hear. Someone just sent a message. They want you to stay silent. A strange, suffocating tension surged within Ethan. Who? He asked, his voice low, as if sensing something wasn't right. But his lawyer only pushed the phone toward him without saying another word. The screen displayed a short, chilling message. Stay silent. There are things bigger than you. A cold shiver ran down Ethan's spine. This was no longer just about him. He had gone too deep into a game he no longer controlled, and now he was just a pawn in someone else's hands. Ethan tried to maintain his calm, but his mind was racing. Who sent this message? What does it mean? And most importantly, am I being watched? Camille continued presenting evidence before the court, but now her words were a distant hum in Ethan's mind. He scanned the room, his gaze passing over every face in the crowd. He felt as though someone was watching him, looking at every movement he made, and he couldn't escape the feeling of an invisible stare full of power, making the space around him feel suffocating, choking the freedom from him. And then he saw him. Sitting in the back row of the courtroom was a man in a perfectly tailored black suit. Nothing about him stood out, but there was an aura of cold menace that was almost palpable. His face was calm, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses, but Ethan felt his presence even though the man was doing nothing. The weight of it pressed on him like a hand around his throat. He knew this man, Giovanni Moretti, a name that even the hardest figures in finance wouldn't dare to speak too loudly. The man who controlled countless deals in the shadows, the mastermind behind major corporations, though no one truly knew the extent of his control. If Ethan was a predator, Giovanni Moretti was the puppet master of the entire forest. Giovanni Moretti didn't need to say anything, but his presence alone was enough to make everything around Ethan seem blurry. If he was here, it could only mean one thing. Ethan had lost control. A cold sweat trickled down Ethan's temple. His heart raced, his mind spinning. He turned to his lawyer, his voice tense and low. I need to know who sent that message, immediately. The lawyer didn't respond, only nodded and began to work on his phone. Ethan didn't even need to look at the device. He knew the truth. The person behind him was watching every move. If he made one wrong move, the consequences wouldn't just be losing his company or wealth. He could lose his very life. His eyes flicked toward Camille, who was still presenting evidence before the court, but now her words were a distant echo. All he could focus on was the realization. He was being pushed into a corner. The courtroom recessed, and the tension in the air was palpable. Camille Hartman's recent presentation of evidence hung heavy in the room, leaving everyone uneasy. The audience whispered among themselves, while the prosecutor huddled with his assistant. But Ethan Caldwell was no longer paying attention to any of it. His thoughts were consumed by what had just transpired. He knew he needed to step away for a moment, clear his head, and gather his thoughts. Rising from his seat, he silently walked out of the courtroom, his gaze briefly flicking to the back row. Giovanni Moretti was still there, silent, unmoving, watching. The realization hit him hard, but there was no time to dwell on it. Ethan walked quickly down the empty hallway, the sound of his leather shoes echoing against the marble floors. He needed to distance himself from the chaos, to regain some semblance of control. But just a few steps in, a voice broke through the silence. Mr. Caldwell. He froze. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The voice was unmistakable. Slowly, Ethan turned to face the man standing just behind him, a tall figure in a perfectly tailored black suit. His presence was commanding, almost suffocating. His face remained neutral, but there was something cold, almost terrifying in his gaze behind his dark sunglasses. Ethan could feel the weight of his eyes. We need to talk. The man's voice was calm but carried an undeniable pressure, as though he had already decided Ethan's fate. Ethan's mind raced, but he kept his expression steady. I don't know who you are, he said, but he knew it was a pointless denial. The man's reply came with a quiet, humorless chuckle. You know who I am. And more importantly, you know who we are." The words were spoken with such certainty that Ethan knew any pretense of ignorance was futile. The man took a step forward, closing the distance between them until only a few inches separated them. "We told you to stay silent," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're talking too much, Ethan." Ethan clenched his fists, fighting the urge to respond impulsively. He could feel his heartbeat quicken, but he knew better than to show weakness. "I haven't said anything," he replied, but even he knew the words felt hollow. The man tilted his head slightly, as though appraising him. "That's fine," he said slowly. "But if you keep revealing more than necessary, things will get complicated." The air between them thickened. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. They were watching him. They knew what he was going to do next. The man took a small step back, his voice lowering like the final warning before a storm. "Stay silent. Continue opposing the trial, and everything will be taken care of. If not..." The rest of the sentence was unnecessary. The meaning was clear. Ethan stood still, the weight of the decision pressing on him. If he betrayed them, exposed everything, he might not leave the building alive. But if he remained silent, he would lose himself, his empire, his control. Everything would slip away, and he would be nothing more than a puppet dancing to their strings. The moment stretched, Ethan's mind spun with the consequences of both choices. He knew there was no way out without a price. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice cold. The man nodded with approval before turning away, disappearing into the crowd. Ethan stood there, feeling as if the walls of the hallway were closing in around him. He had made his choice. There was no going back. The weight of his decision hung over him like a dark cloud, and he knew that whatever happened next, he had lost something vital: his control, his power, maybe even his life. The courtroom door opened for the second time that day, and this time Ethan Caldwell felt as if a heavy stone were pressing down on his chest. A man stepped into the room, his appearance unremarkable, but to Ethan, he was a nightmare cloaked in human form: Michael Whitman. Michael had once been Ethan's most loyal right-hand man, someone who knew every secret, every step Ethan had taken to manipulate the real estate market. He had nurtured Michael, turning him from a lowly assistant into someone who understood the inner workings of the Caldwell empire. But today, Michael Whitman walked into the courtroom no longer as an ally. He was a witness, and with his cold, detached expression, he was coming to deliver the fatal blow to Ethan. Ethan clenched his fists, trying to suppress the overwhelming wave of disbelief and anger that surged through him. He couldn't believe his eyes. "Michael," he murmured, but his voice was drowned out by the growing whispers in the courtroom. Why was Michael here? He had paid him handsomely, given him a life that anyone would envy. Ethan had always treated him as a trusted partner, never questioning his loyalty. But now Michael stood there, the last person he expected to betray him, about to expose everything that Ethan had worked so hard to conceal. Michael didn't even look at him. He walked calmly to the witness stand, glanced briefly at Camille Hartman, and nodded in acknowledgement. Camille didn't seem surprised. She had known this was coming. She had orchestrated it, perhaps even counted on it. "Thank you for being here," she said, flipping through a file with an almost practiced ease. "Mr. Whitman, can you tell the court how long you worked for Mr. Caldwell?" Michael took a deep breath, his voice steady, showing no emotion. 12 years, he replied without hesitation. "I started as an administrative assistant and gradually rose to the position of chief financial officer at Caldwell Real Estate." Ethan sat frozen, the words ringing in his ears like a death knell. He could feel every pair of eyes in the room now focused on him. The curiosity, the anger, and above all, the expectation. The expectation of his collapse. The realization hit him hard. This was it. This was the end of everything. Camille nodded and turned another page in the file, her movements deliberate. "You were present at all of the company's major strategy meetings, correct?" Michael didn't blink, his gaze unwavering. "Correct." "Then," Camille leaned back, her voice slow but sharp, "can you tell the court about the real business strategies Mr. Caldwell applied?" A brief silence fell over the room, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for Michael's next words. The weight of the moment hung in the air, and Ethan felt as if the world was closing in on him. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He wanted to scream, to stop it all, but there was nothing he could do. Michael slowly opened the briefcase in his hands, pulling out a thick stack of documents, and placed them on the evidence table. Ethan's eyes locked onto the papers, his heart racing as he realized what they were: the smoking gun. "I have all the internal documents," Michael said, his voice unshaken, as if he were reading a script he had rehearsed 1,000 times, including files on illegal evictions, fraudulent contracts, shady payments to officials, and deals concealed through shell companies. All of them bear Mr. Caldwell's signature. The room erupted into chaos. Whispers turned into gasps, and the sound of clicking cameras filled the air like the buzzing of angry bees. A few reporters rushed to their phones, typing furiously, while others were left standing in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just heard. The tension in the room was electric, like a storm was brewing, ready to explode at any moment. Ethan's heart raced as the realization set in. He could feel the walls of the courtroom closing in on him, the heat of 100 accusing eyes focused on his every move. He was exposed, vulnerable. The very empire he had built with cunning and manipulation was now crumbling before him. For the first time in his life, he was truly powerless. He had lost control. For the first time in his life, he was truly losing. The weight of Michael's words felt like a physical blow, each one driving a dagger deeper into his chest. The room was spinning, the world around him becoming a blur. He wanted to stand up, shout, defend himself, but no words came. There was nothing he could say, nothing that could save him. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was now being torn apart piece by the very person he had trusted most. And yet, amidst the chaos, there was one question that plagued him more than anything else. How had Michael gotten these documents? How had he known to expose him at this very moment? Was he working with Camille all along? Or had there been a deeper, more insidious force at play? As the courtroom descended into pandemonium, Ethan realized the truth. This wasn't just a betrayal from Michael. This was the beginning of something much bigger, something he couldn't control. His world was collapsing, and he had no way of stopping it. The empire he had spent years building was now being dismantled piece by piece, and he was powerless to stop it. Ethan stepped out of the courtroom, each step heavy as if the world was collapsing beneath his feet. Everything was happening too fast. The evidence, the testimonies, the betraying witnesses, all pointing the finger at him. He had lost control, and if he stayed any longer, he knew the worst would happen. He had to get out now. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the list of contacts who had once been his escape route. In the past, one call was all it took to make a case disappear, to bury anyone who dared go up against him under a mountain of legal procedures. But this time, when he dialed the number, all he heard was the long, hopeless ringing. He tried another number, then another. No one picked up. No response. His breath quickened as he called Vincent Carter, the most powerful lawyer who had always shielded him from lawsuits in the past. Vincent Carter always answered the phone. But this time, after 3 rings, all he got was a lifeless voice. The number you've dialed is not reachable. Ethan gripped the phone tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was wrong. He quickly made his way to the underground parking lot, where his private car was always waiting to take him wherever he needed to go. But when he got there, the parking spot was empty. No driver, no familiar car. No one was waiting for him anymore. He rushed to the roadside, waving for a taxi, trying to stay calm. As the car rolled off, he pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. In his plan, he would fly straight to a country without an extradition treaty, where he could rebuild his power. All he had to do was transfer a large sum of money to an anonymous account, then vanish before anyone could react. But when he entered his password, a cold notification appeared. Your account has been frozen. Please contact the bank for more details. Ethan froze. He tried another account, then another. All of them were locked. Cold sweat ran down his spine. His entire fortune, hundreds of millions of dollars held in international banks, was no longer within his reach. He threw his phone onto the seat, gripping his hair, trying to think. He had never been backed into a corner like this before. Who did this? Who had enough power to sever all his escape routes? There was only one answer. Those who once protected him had turned their backs. Giovanni Moretti. That name echoed in his mind like a death knell. The ones truly controlling this game no longer saw him as a valuable pawn. They had withdrawn all protection, stripped away every ounce of power he once had. Now, he wasn't the hunter. He had become the prey. The taxi suddenly stopped at a red light, jolting Ethan. He looked out the window, desperately searching for an escape. Instead, he saw a black SUV parked not far away, a car without license plates, tinted windows. No one was stepping out. Ethan swallowed hard. He knew exactly what this meant. He wasn't just abandoned. He was being hunted. The rain poured down relentlessly, hammering the roof of the car like a drum beat, heralding an impending doom. Inside the black SUV cutting through the night storm, Ethan Caldwell's breath came in short gasps as he fought to steady his wildly racing heart. Everything was happening too fast, too unexpectedly. He hadn't been ready for this. His head throbbed violently from the brutal impact with the streetlight, and blood from the gash on his forehead streamed down into his eyes, obscuring his vision. But what consumed him more than the sharp sting of pain was the overwhelming terror that gripped his chest. He blinked several times, trying to clear his thoughts, his senses overwhelmed by the searing pain and the urgency of his situation. Looking around in the dark car, Ethan realized that it was just him and three massive men. The two men in black suits sitting behind the wheel were as cold and emotionless as stone, their icy eyes reflected in the rearview mirror, watching him, assessing him. The man sitting beside Ethan, however, remained eerily silent, but the hand he casually rested on his thigh wasn't loose or relaxed. It was a subtle warning. Ethan knew that one wrong move, one false step, and the gun concealed beneath the man's coat would be aimed straight at his head. His hand trembled uncontrollably as he gripped the hem of his jacket, desperately trying to maintain composure. The fear coursing through him was palpable, but he couldn't let them see it. Not now. He had to stay in control. Yet, for the first time in his life, he genuinely had no idea what was going to happen next. The car sped through the darkened roads, winding through areas Ethan had never even dreamed of seeing. He gazed out of the window, his eyes widening as he recognized they were moving farther and farther away from the bustling city center. The vibrant streets filled with neon lights and the hum of life were gone, replaced by dilapidated warehouses, rusted containers, and empty, desolate lots. The sense of isolation, of being completely cut off from everything familiar, hit him like a slap in the face. He knew exactly what this meant. No one could save him here. A cold shiver crept down his spine. These men weren't just a gang of street thugs or mere pawns of the court. They operated with an efficiency and professionalism that left no room for error. This wasn't an act of abuse of power. They were the power. They were the ones pulling the strings, the ones with the resources and the control. And if they had brought him here, it was clear to him now. They had a plan for him, a plan he wasn't a part of. The SUV swerved onto a narrow, poorly maintained road, the tires leaving deep ruts in the mud beneath them. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to collect himself, to stay calm. He couldn't let panic take over, not yet. He needed to find a way out, a way to negotiate, to manipulate his way back into a position of control. He hadn't lost yet. He took a slow, steadying breath and closed his eyes for just a second, trying to calm his nerves. When he opened them again, he steeled himself and forced his face into the confident, commanding mask he had worn for years. He wasn't going to go down without a fight. "I don't know who gave you the orders," he began, his voice rough but still sharp. "But if you think for 1 second that you can just eliminate me, you're making a huge mistake. I have connections, resources, people who could ruin you with a single word." Silence. Ethan's words hung in the air, but they were met with nothing but cold indifference. He turned his gaze to the man beside him, locking eyes with him. "I'm talking to you," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt as he tried to provoke a reaction. But the man didn't flinch. He remained motionless, as impassive as ever. It was like talking to a wall. Ethan gritted his teeth, his pulse pounding harder in his chest. The realization settled in that these men weren't fazed by threats, by his bravado, by anything. They weren't afraid of him. Outside, the landscape grew darker and more sinister. The streetlights, few and far between, gave way to the oppressive shadows of abandoned industrial zones. The SUV's headlights illuminated only the edges of broken-down buildings and neglected factories. Finally, the car slowed, and Ethan's stomach tightened. He knew what was coming. The SUV turned into a narrow alley, the tires scraping against the gravel and mud as it slid into a large, empty warehouse district. The once sleek exterior of the car seemed like a world away from the cold, dirty surroundings. The vehicle came to a halt. The door opened with a metallic creak, and one of the men in the front seat turned to Ethan, giving him a single, decisive nod. "Get out." Ethan hesitated for a moment, his mind racing, trying to come up with a plan, a way to fight back. But he knew deep down that if he stepped out of this car, he would no longer have control over anything. His future, his life, it would no longer be his to decide. But there was no turning back. He had no choice. With one last glance at the darkness outside, Ethan stepped out of the SUV, his polished leather shoes tapping against the cold, damp concrete. The rain and the chill from the night air hit him, but it wasn't the weather that made him shiver. It was the tall, imposing figure waiting for him inside the warehouse. The man stood with his arms folded, leaning slightly against a pillar under a flickering yellow light. His eyes were sharp, cold, and calculating, yet a subtle smile tugged at the corners of his lips, an eerie, knowing smile. Giovanni Moretti. Ethan's stomach lurched at the sight of him. Giovanni Moretti wasn't just another player in the game. He was the one calling the shots. His voice, deep and steady, echoed across the empty warehouse, cutting through the tension like a blade. Finally, you're here. Ethan's fists clenched involuntarily, his heart hammering in his chest. The walls were closing in. He could feel the weight of the moment, the realization that everything he had built, everything he had worked for, had just crumbled in an instant. His game was over. But this was just the beginning of the fight for survival. Inside the old warehouse, the dim yellow lights flickered above, casting long, crooked shadows on the damp concrete floor. The vast space was eerily silent, broken only by the relentless sound of the rain tapping against the windows and the chilling cold that seeped through his clothes. Ethan Caldwell stood alone, surrounded by the very people who had once protected him, who had served him without question. But tonight, they were no longer his allies. Before him, Giovanni Moretti, the man whom even the most powerful feared and respected, slowly advanced, his presence commanding the space. His black suit was flawless, not a wrinkle in sight, and the gold ring on his finger gleamed in the faint light. But it wasn't the suit or the ring that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. It was the eyes, cold, deep, and still, like an abyss that could swallow anyone foolish enough to stare too long. Giovanni Moretti stopped just a few feet away from Ethan. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips, but there was no warmth in it, only a chilling sense of finality. Ethan, he said, his voice calm yet carrying an undeniable weight of authority. I remember when we first met. You were so confident. You thought you could go anywhere, do anything, and never face the consequences. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over Ethan's tense face. But now, things are different, aren't they? Ethan clenched his fists, trying to maintain control, forcing his voice to remain steady. I don't know what you're talking about, Giovanni, he replied. But even he could hear the doubt creeping into his words. Giovanni Moretti chuckled softly, but the sound was laced with danger. Oh, you know exactly what I'm talking about, he said, taking another step closer, his presence a heavy weight pressing down on Ethan's chest. You've become a liability. We can't allow you to keep breathing. The words hit Ethan like a death sentence. His chest tightened as the gravity of the situation sank in. He had once been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms, ordering others around like pieces on a chessboard. But now, he was the pawn, discarded, expendable, and no longer of value. He swallowed hard, desperate to find a way out. I still have value, he said, his voice urgent. If you want me gone, I'll leave the country. I'll disappear, never to be seen again. I can't. No. Giovanni Moretti interrupted sharply, his voice as cold as ice. The issue isn't where you go. It's that you know too much. The room seemed to close in around Ethan. The air grew thick, suffocating. He realized he had no way out. If he remained silent, he would die. But if he betrayed these men, there was a chance he could survive, though it would cost him everything. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room as he considered his options. Giovanni, he said, his tone shifting to something more calculated. I have a proposition. Giovanni Moretti raised an eyebrow, his posture stiffening slightly. Oh, I'm listening. Ethan leaned forward, lowering his voice. I can help you bring down the entire system. I know how it works. I know who's taking the money, who's making the decisions, who can be bought. If you let me live, I can help you control everything. No one will be able to stop you. A long silence followed. The men around them exchanged fleeting glances, but no one spoke. Giovanni Moretti narrowed his eyes, as if measuring whether Ethan's offer was worth considering. Ethan pressed on, his words now sharper, more forceful. I know the inner workings of this system. I know who's corrupt, who's vulnerable, and who's pulling the strings. If you let me live, I can give you all of it. Control, power, everything. Giovanni Moretti remained silent for a moment. Then he let out a low, mocking laugh. You think you can bargain with me, Ethan? He asked, his voice dripping with amusement, but laced with menace. You think you can betray those who helped you build your empire, and then come to us for help? Ethan swallowed hard, but didn't back down. You can kill me right now, he said, his voice steady despite the growing tension. But if you do, you'll lose an invaluable source of information. You know I'm not lying. I know everything, and I'm willing to sell it all to save my life." Giovanni Moretti stared at him for a long, unnerving moment. The faint light above cast eerie shadows on his face, accentuating the cold, calculating look in his eyes. Ethan felt as though the entire world had frozen, holding its breath, waiting for Giovanni Moretti's decision. After what felt like an eternity, Giovanni Moretti slowly tilted his head. "You want to team up with Camille Hartman, don't you?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't expected Giovanni Moretti to already know his intentions. Giovanni Moretti smiled, but this time the smile was devoid of any amusement. "Very well," he said, his voice deliberate and slow. "But if you betray me, I'll make sure you regret it. I'll end you myself." He turned on his heel, signaling to his men. Two of the enforcers immediately moved forward, grabbing Ethan by the arms and hauling him to his feet. "Take him away," Giovanni Moretti ordered. "We have much work to do." Ethan's heart raced. He had made his choice. But as they pulled him away, Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't the right path. This was just another trap waiting to snap shut around him. Ethan Caldwell sat in a small room, the harsh white light from the fluorescent bulb above casting a cold glow on his face, highlighting the bruises that remained from the hellish night. The room was bare, furnished with just an old wooden table, two chairs facing each other, and a camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling, recording his every move. This was not a plush boardroom in a financial firm. This was the interrogation room of the federal prosecutor's office. Across from him sat Camille Hartman, the young judge he had once mocked, now staring at him with eyes sharper than ever. Ethan could feel her power, not derived from wealth or political connections as he had always believed, but from her belief in justice, something he had never valued before. He rested his hands on the table, trying to maintain a composed demeanor, but deep down he knew he had lost. No more legal team to shield him. No more shadowy figures pulling strings in the dark to save him. No more millions of dollars to bribe judges. There was only one way out: betray those who had once supported him. Camille folded her arms and leaned slightly back in her chair. "I don't have all day," she said in a steady voice. "Have you made your decision?" Ethan took a deep breath, staring at her for what felt like an eternity, as if still searching for an alternative. But he knew deep down there was no other option. "All right," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'll talk, but I need to be sure that I won't die in the process." Camille didn't blink. "No one can guarantee that, Mr. Caldwell. But if you cooperate, we can protect you to the fullest extent possible." Ethan laughed bitterly, the sound dry and hollow. "You don't understand. These people are not like regular businessmen. This is a network of underground power, operating behind the government, controlling markets, politics, and the justice system. Do you think you can topple them with just a public trial?" Camille leaned forward, her gaze icy and unwavering. "I don't think so, Mr. Caldwell, but I know we can start with you." Ethan stared at her for several seconds, then slowly nodded. "I have all the documents," he said. "The money laundering transactions, the bribery contracts, a list of those who took money from us, and even the evidence of Moretti and his gang's illegal activities." Camille raised an eyebrow. "Even Moretti?" Ethan nodded. "If I die, he dies with me." A moment of silence hung in the air, thick with tension. Camille studied him, trying to gauge whether he was telling the truth or just a desperate man grasping at the last straw. Then, slowly, she nodded. "All right," she said. "We'll start immediately." The door to the room opened, and the federal prosecutor walked in, holding a thick stack of files. They began drafting a witness protection agreement for Ethan, something just days ago no one would have believed possible. Ethan Caldwell, once at the pinnacle of the financial world, was now becoming a key player in bringing down the entire underground power structure. But would he truly survive after exposing everything? Or was this just another path leading to his death? The door to the courtroom opened once more, but this time Ethan Caldwell no longer entered with the arrogant swagger he had displayed on the first day. Gone were the custom-tailored suits, the polished leather shoes, and the $100,000 watch gleaming on his wrist. He stood there in simple attire, his face gaunt, but his eyes, for the first time in his life, no longer held any illusions. All that remained was resignation and a final, unshakable resolve. The courtroom was packed. The media, powerful figures from the financial world, politicians, even business allies who had once stood beside him all were present. But they weren't here to support him. They were here because they knew that today would mark the day when an entire system would change. Ethan took a deep breath, then slowly walked toward the witness stand. As he sat down, His gaze briefly met Camille Hartman's, the only woman in this room whom he truly feared. She didn't look at him with pity or contempt. She looked at him as though he was a man about to make a decision that no one else dared to. The prosecutor stood and walked toward him. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice booming across the room. "Do you have any statements to make before the court today?" Ethan gripped the table, his thoughts still in turmoil. He could choose silence. He could deny everything. He could try to bargain with his lawyer for another chance at survival. But he knew deep down that this time there was no escape. He lifted his head and met the eyes of the people waiting for him to speak. A moment passed, and then he spoke, no longer a smug wolf, but a man who had accepted his fate. "I, Ethan Caldwell, admit to all the charges against me." The courtroom erupted. Whispers, the clicking of camera shutters, gasps of shock from those who had never expected him to surrender so easily. But Ethan didn't stop there. He turned to face the prosecutor. "But I am not the only one." A chilling silence swept over the room. Ethan slowly surveyed the audience, then continued. "This system is rotten, not just because of men like me, but because of those above me. Those who have manipulated the financial industry, politics, and the very justice system itself." He turned and locked eyes with Judge Camille Hartman. "Today, I will tell you everything." Camille gave a slight nod, then gestured to the prosecutor. A large screen flickered to life, displaying a series of classified documents, lists of money laundering transactions, bribed officials, corporations pulling the strings behind market manipulation. Everything Ethan knew was now presented as irrefutable evidence. A wave of shock washed over the courtroom. The powerful figures in the audience began to shift uneasily. Some hurriedly exited the room. Others fumbled with their phones, likely calling their lawyers or, worse, the people who could clean up the mess. But it was too late. "These men have been behind everything for decades," Ethan continued, his voice no longer trembling. "They are the ones who truly control this game, and I was just a pawn." At that moment, the courtroom doors burst open. A group of federal agents stormed in, holding arrest warrants. The names on the list were read aloud. CEOs, politicians, those once untouchable. A series of arrests took place right there, in front of everyone. Shouts, protests, reporters screaming questions that no one had the answers to. Ethan sat still in the witness chair, watching the chaos unfold before him with an eerie calm. He had once believed he was the strongest, but in truth, he was just a small cog in a much larger, far-reaching machine. The prosecutor turned to him. "Mr. Caldwell, is there anything else you wish to say before we conclude?" Ethan took a deep breath, then slowly shook his head. He had said enough. Judge Camille Hartman struck her gavel down, declaring the trial concluded. An underground financial empire had just crumbled before everyone's eyes. And Ethan Caldwell, once an arrogant man standing above all, now sat as a weary, broken figure, escorted out of the courtroom under the protection of federal security. Life is like a game of chess, where every decision you make can lead to unforeseen consequences. Ethan Caldwell once believed that power and money could shield him forever, that no one could touch him. But in the end, he learned that the truth always finds a way to be revealed, and no one can run away from the consequences of their own actions forever. Ethan's story is a profound lesson on greed, arrogance, and the consequences of poor choices. It serves as a reminder that no matter how high you rise, if you build your success on lies, exploitation, and manipulation, one day it will come crashing down beneath your feet. The law of cause and effect never misses anyone. You may escape for a time, but you cannot escape forever. In the real world, we too face similar situations, not necessarily shocking trials or financial empires collapsing, but the decisions we make in our daily lives. We have the choice to live honestly or deceitfully, to help others or trample on them, to use power for good or for personal gain. Every choice comes at a cost, and the important thing is whether you have the courage to choose the right path from the start. Remember, money and power can take you far, but only integrity will sustain you. The world may be full of injustice, but there are people like Camille Hartman, those who fear nothing in the face of power, those who always fight for justice. And if ever you feel trapped in a cycle of wrong choices, remember you can always start over, as long as you have the courage to face the truth. Live in such a way that when you look back, you have no regrets. Choose to be a person of value rather than just a wealthy one.